And now to our third and final talk in the session.
It's going to take some time.
Okay, so we'll have Majid Khabbazian presenting a joint work with Mohammad, Amin, Vafadar, and it's on a Condorcet attack against fair transaction ordering. Majid, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. So as mentioned earlier today, ordering transaction is important, right? And today I'm going to talk about a threat, an attack against fair ordering of transaction. This is a joint work with my student, Mohammad, who couldn't unfortunately be here today. So when it comes to ordering transactions, there are different approaches. So one general approach is to use a committee of members, nodes, to do the task, to decide on the ordering instead of just one node. And this committee of nodes basically receive transactions from clients, from users, and they have to decide collectively on a final order based on a policy. For example, the policy could be first in, first served. And there are many methods in the literature that work based on this approach and this policy. And one of them is Themis, which is one of the best ones in this category. And that's why we stick to it for the purpose of this attack, to see how this attack works, the attack that I'm going to present today. A little bit about Themis. It's a leader-based approach, meaning that one of the members in the committee is a leader. All the members in the committee receive transactions from clients, from users, and they send a report to the leader. Basically, in the report, they say which transaction to receive first. They report the order of transactions. The leader receives all this local ordering and makes a decision according to an algorithm and basically notifies everyone of this final ordering. And honest node agree on this ordering and they make consensus on this. That is generally how it works. Themis has some interesting properties. One of them is that it doesn't need any time synchronization between nodes in the committee, which is great because having tight synchronization in the committee is, it has its own challenges. So it's good to know that it doesn't need it. The other thing is that it has a promise. Themis has a promise. It says if majority of nodes in the committee, in the system, receive a transaction, let's say A before B, then the algorithm orders A before B, unless there is a special situation where A and B fall into a so-called Condorcet cycle. So if that doesn't happen, we have that promise by Themis. And we cannot blame Themis for this violation of the promise because theoretically, when we have a Condorcet cycle, any algorithm will fail to bring that promise, to keep that promise. Well, most of you, I assume, know about this Condorcet cycle. In case you don't, I have a simple example of it. In this example, we have 3 nodes in the committee, node 1, 2, and 3, and only 3 transactions, transaction 1, 2, and 3. Each member of the committee, as you can see, received this transaction, 3 transactions in different order. So node 1 received the transaction 1 first, then transaction 2 and transaction 3 next. Node 2 in a different order, transaction 2 first, transaction 3 next, and transaction 1, and so on. Now, if I use a graph to represent those orderings, in the graph I use a vertex to represent the transaction, and use an edge, let's say from transaction 1 to transaction 2, if transaction 1 was reported to have been received before transaction 2 by majority of nodes, in case 2 nodes out of 3, I get a graph like this. If you look at this graph, there is a cycle in the graph. And this is basically what's called Condorcet cycle. And because of this cycle, we cannot keep the promise. If, for example, in the final ordering, I go with transaction 1 first, then I broke the promise because majority of node thinks that transaction 3 should be placed before transaction 1. If I go with transaction 3 first in the final ordering, again, I break the promise because transaction 2 by most of the committee members is believed to be placed before transaction 3 and so on. So when the cycle happens, like this Condorcet cycle happens, we theoretically cannot keep that promise. Okay, you may wonder if such Condorcet cycle happen in practice. The answer is yes. Sometimes those cycles are common. Sometimes they are rare. Sometimes they are common. Here's a sample from the simulation results. The y-axis shows the chance of seeing a Condorcet cycle. For this result, we used two exponential distribution, one to represent network delay. So yes, network delay is a random number, a random variable. And for that, we assume that it follows a distribution, exponential distribution with that mu. That mean mu subnet. We use exponential distribution for transaction generation. So time interval between two consecutive transactions is assumed to follow an exponential distribution with that mean mu x. And this ratio, which is referred as network ratio, used for the x-axis. So as you see in this figure, which was basically done over two committee sizes, almost 20 nodes in one setting, 100 nodes in another setting. In both cases, you see that as the network ratio increases, we'll see more and more Condorcet cycles. When network ratio is small, Condorcet cycles are rare. But when network ratio is high, in fact, they are common. Okay? And so they do occur in practice. But the good news is that it's not so bad to see Condorcet cycle in practice, because if you go inside the Condorcet cycle and look at the transaction there, we'll see that most transactions inside the cycle, all of them, in fact, are transmitted within around the same time with respect to the network delay. For example, if network delay has a variation of 20 milliseconds, let's say, and you go inside the cycle, look at the timing of the transaction when they transmitted, you will see that they were transmitted around the same time, 20 milliseconds or so. So we cannot blame a system not to be able to order transactions within cycle, because essentially the order of those transactions could be changed by the network itself. Okay, so that's not so bad. Okay, the bad news is that an adversary can impose a cycle, perhaps a bigger cycle that can naturally happen. For example, an adversary that controls a fraction of nodes, what it can do is that it can ask all the nodes to report the true ordering in reverse, something like that. And that can create a cycle, or if there's a cycle there, it can make the cycle bigger. Again, some samples from the simulation result shows that, yeah, that's the case. This particular attack where the adversary changes the ordering of nodes, ordering of transactions, can make cycles bigger compared to the honest setting, which is the green one. So the green one is honest setting. The red one is the setting where adversary, I believe, controls about a quarter of nodes, and all those nodes report the truth ordering in reverse. So yes, it has some impact on the size of Condorcet cycle, but as you can see, the impact is not huge, right? The Condorcet cycles are still around the same size that they used to be. Now, here's the ugly news. The ugly news is that there is a way to make a big Condorcet cycle. And what it makes it worse is that it's possible to make those big cycles even when all the nodes are honest. Well, how do we do that? The only thing we need is a malicious client, malicious user outside the system. And this user basically injects a couple of packets. Just a couple of packets is enough. But it has to inject it in a timely manner to the system. So even if all the nodes are honest, that client, simple client, can inject a large Condorcet cycle to the system. To give you an example, just again consider those 3 nodes in the committee, and assume that we have some honest transactions, TX1, TX2, and TX3. And there are some dishonest, legitimate, but dishonest transactions, A and B, transmitted by dishonest user. So if you just ignore the red transactions, you will see that the system has an easy job of ordering transactions. Or everyone sees the same ordering, transaction 1 first, 2 second, 3rd next. So the system will be absolutely fine. But now consider a node outside the system sending these 2 transactions, red ones, A and B, in a special order. Like first, it sends A and B to node 1, B to node 2 and nothing to node 3. And then the client waits for some time, and after that time, it sends A to node 2 and A and B to node 3, just that. So send a couple of transactions first, wait, and then send some other at some other time. So now if I plot the graph for that particular ordering, I get something like this, okay? And if you look at that graph, you will see that there is a cycle now there. And yes, all the transactions fall within that cycle. And the leader has now break this cycle to make a final ordering. And the act of breaking the cycle can introduce unfairness, okay? Okay, and again, something from the simulation results. The green curve is when we don't have any dishonest nodes in the system. Everyone is honest. We don't have a dishonest user outside the system. And we are focusing on the region when network ratio is small. So Condorcet cycles naturally do not occur in that region, as you can see. But look at the red one, the orange curve, actually. This is the curve when the dishonest user from outside the system is injecting transaction to the system. And it can create a large Condorcet cycle of about 50 transactions, total number of transactions actually transmitted during the time. So yes, the impact of this simple attack is sort of huge. Okay, so how can we mitigate the attack? Well, the attack is simple, very simple. Mitigation, not so much. For example, one idea to mitigate the attack is this. Say, okay, look at the graph. We do have Condorcet cycle there, but some of the edges are stronger. Like the blue edges have a weight of 3. 3 out of 3 nodes believe that TX1 should be placed before TX2, and so on. The red edges, on the other hand, are not that strong. 2 out of 3 believe that A should be placed before B, or transaction 3 before A. So one idea to mitigate the attack is something like that. Okay, basically, the idea is the rank pairs algorithm, which is a very famous algorithm in the context of social choice theory, with many interesting properties, this rank pair algorithm, very simple algorithm. So it says, okay, let's consider the weight of edges and bring edges one by one from the strongest to the weakest. Whenever there's a cycle, we just remove the edge, something like that. So let's say we put this first as a weight of 3, we put this, next one is okay, no cycles so far. Next one, this one creates a cycle, so we just remove it. We go to the next one, again, creates a cycle, we remove it. Next one doesn't create a cycle, so keep it. It creates a cycle, remove it. Next one doesn't create a cycle, so keep it. And we are done with all the edges. So now we don't have any cycles, and if you go with the ordering that this DAG suggests, we'll get this basic ordering, which is not so bad, right? Okay, so yes. This algorithm, rank pairs, if you use it, seems to be nice. It's easy to implement. And even if there is no attack, it's good to implement these rank pairs, because even in case there is no attack, everyone is honest, it improves the fairness within cycles. And also we prove that the algorithm prevents the attack when we have these two conditions. One is that all the nodes are honest. The other one is that all the honest transactions are received in the same order. So in this particular setting, under these two conditions, the attack is prevented. But if one of these two strong conditions is not hold, the attack can still happen, right? Still, the attacker can impose a cycle. For example, if not all the nodes are honest, even if a single node is dishonest, the attack is still there. And to see why, again, I can go to the example we had. Assume that node 1 is dishonest, and instead of reporting this, it reports the honest transaction in the other way, in the reverse order. In this case, you can check that, still we have this kind of, all the edges have the same weight, so again, some unfairness can happen. Okay, so second mitigation. And the idea is this. Say, all the nodes within the committee broadcast the transaction as soon as they receive it. For example, as soon as node 1 receives A and B, it will broadcast it inside the system to all the other nodes, node 2 and 3. So in that case, assuming that the internal network, the system between these nodes, the network is fast enough, what we get is something more like the other one. So you see, it breaks the strategy of the attacker. Now, with that ordering, we are safe. Nothing will happen. No cycles will happen. So that's the idea of the second mitigation. Well, it prevents the attack. If the internal network is fast enough, as soon as one node receives the transaction, other nodes will receive it too. But it brings more computational overhead to the algorithm and also fails if internal network is not fast enough, or if the adversary controls the messages within the internal network. Again, some result from simulations. The orange curve is when we have this adversarial node, adversarial client outside the system imposing cycle. The blue one is when everyone is honest. And the green one is the result of the second mitigation based on broadcasting. And as you can see, it has some good impact up until some network ratio around 1 is very effective. But after that, it loses its effect. Okay, so in the paper, we presented one more mitigation that I didn't present here. One good thing about this mitigation is that they can be implemented together. They complement each other. So one way to make them stronger is to implement all of them. Of course, it will come at a cost, but that's one way to handle it. Well, yeah, as I mentioned, this attack is very simple. You can easily see that it works. But unfortunately, it's not so easy to prevent it. We can have some ideas to prevent attack under certain conditions, but we couldn't find a mitigation that works, all the time. And yeah, the other thing is that if we want to implement any fair ordering method, we definitely need to consider this type of attack, especially attack based on injecting transaction to the system. This is something that usually is not considered. And that's the power of the attack, through injecting packets to the system, not just changing the order. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the talk. And do we have any questions from the audience?
So the mitigation you mentioned on just broadcasting the transactions, isn't that how mempools already work? And so what's new, and why is it also why is it really communication inefficient? Because you would just gossip to in a peer-to-peer network.
So essentially, mainly, I didn't mention this, but what we had in mind was permissionless, permissioned system, right? So we don't have natural dot broadcast necessarily. We don't have that. Like Themis doesn't have it, but some algorithms do. So we don't have it. And yes, if we add it, for example, to Themis, it will increase its complexity. I guess the author of Themis is here. We can double check with him. It will increase the complexity of the communication complexity of Themis, right? So yeah, it has an impact on the communication complexity if implemented.
We have time for one more quick question.
So I'm a bit confused by one aspect. I'm an economist, so for me the easiest reference here is everything has to do with social choice theorem, where arrow impossibility theorem, if you do certain voting. But essentially there the idea is that the issue arises because you're doing majority voting. So you're voting pairwise, and you always look, it's like majority voting for this option against that option. Sure. But there are other ways to aggregate preferences that don't give rise to Condorcet cycle. For example, you can do board account. That in this example would be like each node gives 1 to the first transaction it sees, 2 to the second transaction, so on and so forth, and you sum everything across everybody, and the one with the lowest point is ranked first in the aggregate, second, so on and so forth. That eliminates Condorcet cycle. It doesn't mean that it cannot be attacked by some other ways, but this seems to be the most natural way to do it, because The whole idea of using pairwise voting, so majority voting, is that in practice you cannot elicit preferences of people over all possible options to aggregate socially. Like you want to know whether people vote yes or no to building the bridge. You cannot poll them on all possible ways you can use the money.
Right.
But here, anyway, you want to pool all possible ways. And so might as well use a choice that requires to report the full preferences in order to then aggregate.
Right. I guess in this context, it's more justifiable to use that method because it's possible to collect all those votings in the network, while in some other contexts, like social choice theory, might not be a good idea to implement. So that's one thing. The other thing is that this attack that I introduced works when we have a system like that, voting-based system like that. If you use Borda, for example, that algorithm may not be vulnerable to this attack. Or if you use time synchronization or anything that assign a score, for example, to transaction based on timing or anything else, probably it's immune against this attack, right? But this one, yes. So Themis uses this and makes this promise, although according to Arrow's theorem, it's not possible to always keep that promise. And that's okay, sort of speaking, if there is no adversary. Because again, as I mentioned, whenever they have cycle, if you go inside the cycles, all the transactions within the cycles are transmitted around the same time. So if we make a mistake within the cycle, it's not a huge mistake. So I guess one aspect is that within different contexts, something makes sense. In the other context, it may not make sense. But we can talk more about that.
Let's thank the speaker again.